The forest was older than anything I'd ever seen, so ancient it felt like it had been forgotten by time itself. Our team of 5 stood on its edge, surrounded by thick, silent trees that seemed to watch us as we prepared to venture inside. Dr. Evelyn Marks led the expedition. She was the type who didn't believe in myths or legends, though the locals had given us plenty of both before we arrived. El Bosque Sangriento, they called it, the bleeding forest. I thought it was just a colorful name, like something to scare kids into staying away. Now, standing here with my gear strapped to my back, I wasn't so sure. "Let's get moving," Evelyn said briskly, her boots crunching the dirt as she marched forward. Ryan, the youngest of us, adjusted his glasses nervously. "You don't think there's anything to what they said, do you, about people disappearing?" Evelyn glanced back with a small, patronizing smile. "Superstition thrives where science is scarce. We're here to study biodiversity, not ghost stories." Luis, our botanist, chuckled and clapped Ryan on the shoulder. "Don't worry, kid. Worst thing out here is probably a bear, and we've got bear spray for that." Dana, our tech expert, said nothing as she checked her GPS, her brow furrowing slightly. She wasn't the type to scare easily, but she'd been quiet ever since we arrived. The first step into the forest felt like crossing a threshold into another world. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the canopy above was so dense that only thin shafts of light pierced through. It smelled of damp earth and decay, a rich, almost overpowering aroma that made the air feel heavy. I wasn't a superstitious person, but there was something about the silence that unsettled me. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves. Just the sound of our footsteps and the occasional rustling of our gear. "Spooky, huh?" Ryan muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. "Yeah, feels wrong." We set up a base camp in a clearing about 2 miles in. The trees here were massive, their roots twisting and knotting together like veins. Evelyn wasted no time assigning tasks. Ryan and I were to take soil and water samples, while Luis cataloged the flora. Dana set up sensors to measure atmospheric data and monitor wildlife activity. By midday, we'd spread out but stayed within shouting distance. I was kneeling by a stream collecting a vial of murky water when Ryan called out, his voice sharp, "Hey, you guys need to see this!" We regrouped quickly, and Ryan led us to a towering tree with bark so dark it was almost black. It wasn't the color that caught our attention, though. It was the sap. Thick, red, and viscous, it oozed from deep gashes in the bark. It looked like blood. "That's not right," Luis murmured, stepping closer. He reached out to touch it. "Wait," Evelyn snapped, but it was too late. Luis's fingers sank into the sap, and for a moment he froze, his face twisting in revulsion. "It's warm," he said, pulling his hand back. The sap clung to his skin, refusing to drip off. It glistened in the faint light, a deep crimson that seemed to pulse. No one said anything for a moment. Then Evelyn broke the silence. "Take a sample," she said, her voice steady. "We'll analyze it back at the lab." As Luis carefully filled a vial, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Somewhere deep in the forest, a branch snapped, loud as a gunshot. We stayed gathered around the tree for a while, staring at the red sap that seemed alive. Luis had filled a sample vial, but the look on his face told me he wished he hadn't. He kept wiping his fingers on his pants, muttering under his breath. "It won't come off," he said, holding up his hand. The sap clung to his skin in thin streaks, shimmering like wet paint. "Try the stream," Evelyn suggested. She was calm, but her eyes hadn't left the tree. Luis knelt by the water and scrubbed his hands furiously. The sap didn't budge. It smeared and spread, darkening as if burrowing deeper into his skin. "Stop," Evelyn ordered, crouching beside him. She pulled out a bottle of rubbing alcohol from her pack and poured it over his hand. The sap hissed faintly but stayed put. Luis swore under his breath. "It's like it's alive," Ryan said, his voice barely audible. Evelyn turned sharply. "Don't be ridiculous. It's a natural substance. We'll figure it out back at the lab." But her tone betrayed her. She didn't believe her own words. The forest seemed to grow darker as we continued our work. Evelyn insisted we stick to the plan, so we collected samples, cataloged plants, and made notes. None of us strayed far from the others. The bleeding tree, as we started calling it, was the focal point of our research now. As the hours passed, an oppressive feeling settled over us. The silence was suffocating, the stillness unnatural. Even the faint rustle of wind through the leaves seemed forced, like the forest was holding its breath. Then Dana spoke up. "Did anyone else hear that?" We froze. "Hear what?" Evelyn asked, her voice tight. Dana hesitated, scanning the trees. "I don't know. A sound, like crying." Ryan laughed nervously. "Maybe it's just the wind." "It wasn't the wind," Dana said firmly. We tried to laugh it off, but the tension grew thicker with every passing minute. It didn't help that the sap had started appearing on other trees. Ryan spotted another about 20 yards from the first, and then another beyond that. Soon we were surrounded by them, trees bleeding crimson from gaping wounds in their bark. Evelyn was determined to stay rational. "It's probably a fungal infection or some kind of disease," she said, though her voice wavered. "We've seen similar phenomena in other ecosystems." Luis, however, wasn't listening. He was staring at his hand, now streaked with veins of dark red that seemed to glow faintly under the fading sunlight. "I don't feel right," he muttered. "Maybe you're having a reaction," Evelyn said. "We should head back to camp and monitor your condition." But as we packed up to leave, the forest came alive. A branch snapped in the distance, then another. The sounds were deliberate, like footsteps. The air grew heavy with the smell of rot, and I swear I saw the trees shudder. "We need to leave," Dana said urgently. "Now!" As we started back, the screams began. The screams came from everywhere and nowhere, a chilling, guttural sound that didn't belong to anything human. It echoed through the trees, bouncing off the trunks and making it impossible to pinpoint a direction. Ryan froze, his face pale. "That's not an animal, is it?" "No," Evelyn said, though she didn't elaborate. "Keep moving, back to camp." We picked up our pace, the underbrush snapping beneath our boots. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting something to leap out of the shadows. But the forest remained still, its darkened canopy swallowing what little sunlight remained. We stumbled into the clearing where we'd set up camp, but the sight waiting for us wasn't reassuring. The tents were shredded. Our equipment was scattered, some of it broken, as though something had rampaged through in our absence. Evelyn immediately began taking inventory, muttering curses under her breath, but I couldn't take my eyes off the claw marks in the dirt, deep gouges that looked like they'd been made by something massive. "Who could have done this?" Dana asked, her voice trembling. "There's no one else out here, right?" Evelyn looked up, her jaw tight. "A bear, maybe, or wolves. Let's secure what we can and keep the fire going. We'll sort this out in the morning." But there was no sorting out the feeling creeping over us. Something was wrong, fundamentally wrong, and we all knew it. Luis sat by the fire, staring at his hand. The sap had spread further, dark veins now crawling up his wrist and into his arm. His breathing was shallow, and sweat dripped down his face despite the cool evening air. "We need to leave," he said suddenly. "Forget the samples, forget everything. We need to get out of here." Evelyn shook her head. "Not at night. The terrain's too dangerous, and without GPS we'll just get lost." "Maybe we're already lost," Ryan muttered. Dana knelt beside Luis, examining his arm. "This isn't just a reaction," she said. "It's spreading. Evelyn, we need to take this seriously." Evelyn rubbed her temples. "We'll monitor him tonight. First thing in the morning, we'll head back to the rendezvous point." But the forest wasn't going to wait until morning. As night fell, the oppressive silence returned. No wind, no insects, nothing but the crackle of the fire. I sat close to the flames, gripping a stick like it would do me any good if something came at us. Ryan was on watch when he saw the first face. It was in the bark of a tree just beyond the firelight. A face, human-like, but twisted, its mouth open in a silent scream. "Guys," Ryan whispered, his voice shaking, "do you see that?" We turned, and there it was, grotesque and unmistakable. The face seemed to ripple, its features contorting as if alive. Then it disappeared, melting back into the bark as though it had never been there. "I'm not crazy," Ryan stammered. "I saw it." "You're not crazy," Dana said, her voice flat. She pointed to another tree. "Because there's another one." The faces were everywhere. The faces were grotesque, shifting and blending into the bark as if the trees themselves were alive. Some of the faces screamed silently, mouths twisted wide in eternal agony, while others seemed to watch us with unblinking, hollow eyes. "No," Ryan said, shaking his head. "This can't be real. It's some kind of hallucination, right? Tell me I'm hallucinating." Evelyn didn't answer. Her flashlight beam swept across the forest, catching more faces. They stretched up the trunks and down the roots, some so faint they were almost shadows, others so vivid it felt like they might reach out. Dana backed closer to the fire. "We need to leave," she said, her voice tight. "Screw the samples, screw everything. We're not supposed to be here." Luis groaned, clutching his arm. The red sap had climbed past his elbow now, spreading like veins of molten lava. His breathing grew labored, and his skin was hot to the touch. "I can feel them," he whispered. "The trees. They're alive. They're watching us." Evelyn grabbed him by the shoulders. "Luis, focus. What are you talking about?" "They're angry," he murmured, his eyes unfocused. "We took from them, hurt them, and now they want us." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Evelyn released him and turned to the rest of us, her expression hard. "We're leaving at first light," she said. "No arguments. We'll head straight back to the rendezvous point and call for extraction. Until then, we stay together, stay by the fire, and keep our heads." But the forest had other plans. The faces in the trees seemed to ripple in the flickering firelight, their features growing more defined with each passing minute. The silence was oppressive, so thick it felt like it was pressing against my ears. And then came the first sound, a low creak like wood groaning under pressure. It came from somewhere in the darkness, followed by another and another, until it sounded like a chorus of bending trees. "What the hell is that?" Ryan asked, his voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, one of the trees in the distance shuddered violently, its trunk twisting unnaturally. The red sap burst from its bark, splattering onto the ground like arterial spray. Luis screamed, clutching his chest. His body convulsed, and he collapsed onto the dirt. "Luis," Dana cried, rushing to his side. His eyes rolled back and his skin turned an ashen gray. The red veins in his arm pulsed, glowing faintly, as if something inside him was alive. Then he stopped moving. Dana knelt over him, shaking his shoulders. "Luis, wake up, please!" For a moment, nothing happened, and then his body jerked violently, his mouth opening wide in a soundless scream. His eyes snapped open, but they weren't his anymore. They were dark, empty, and hollow. The forest had taken him. Luis's body convulsed on the ground, his limbs twitching as if being controlled by unseen strings. His skin darkened, taking on the rough texture of bark. The red veins pulsed brighter, branching out over his chest and face. "Step back," Evelyn barked, pulling Dana away from him. "But he's still alive," Dana protested, tears streaming down her face. "No, he's not," Evelyn said grimly, her eyes fixed on Luis. "That's not him anymore." Luis's head turned toward us with a slow, unnatural motion. His eyes, those hollow, dark voids, seemed to stare right through us. He rose to his feet jerkily, like a puppet on strings, his movements awkward and stiff. "Luis?" Ryan asked hesitantly, his voice trembling. Luis, or whatever he had become, didn't answer. Instead, he took a staggering step forward. The red sap dripped from his fingers, leaving dark stains on the ground. The firelight reflected off his twisted features, making him look like a walking nightmare. Evelyn grabbed a branch from the fire, the end glowing red-hot. "Stay back," she warned, holding it out like a weapon. Luis didn't stop. His movements became faster, more fluid, as if he were adjusting to his new form. He lunged at Dana, who screamed and stumbled backward. Evelyn swung the burning branch, striking him across the chest. Luis let out a horrible guttural sound, a mix of a growl and a scream. The sap on his body ignited, flames crawling up his chest and arms. He thrashed violently, the firelight casting monstrous shadows across the trees. For a moment it seemed like the flames would consume him. But then the sap pulsed again, brighter than ever, and the fire snuffed out like a candle. Luis stood there, his body smoldering, the sap dripping from him in thick, glowing streams. "We can't fight this," Dana whispered, her voice shaking. "We need to get out of here." Evelyn nodded. "Grab what you can carry. We're leaving, now." We scrambled to gather our gear, all the while keeping an eye on Luis. He stood motionless, watching us with those hollow eyes. The faces in the trees seemed to move more now, their features shifting as if mocking us. As we packed up, The forest itself seemed to close in. The trees groaned and creaked, their branches twisting and reaching like skeletal arms. The path we had taken into the clearing was gone, replaced by an impenetrable wall of trees. "We're trapped," Ryan said, panic rising in his voice. "No," Evelyn said firmly, though her face was pale. "There's always a way out. We just have to find it." But the forest wasn't going to make it easy. As we started moving, the screams returned, louder this time, closer. They came from every direction, blending into a cacophony of anguish and terror. The ground beneath our feet felt alive, pulsing faintly with every step, and somewhere behind us, Luis followed. The screams followed us, blending with the creaks and groans of the forest. Every step we took felt heavier, like the ground itself was trying to drag us down. Evelyn led the way, gripping her flashlight in one hand and a hunting knife in the other. "Don't look back," she warned, her voice tight, but it was impossible not to. Behind us, Luis, or what was left of him, stalked our group with a slow, deliberate pace. His head twitched unnaturally, his dark eyes gleaming in the faint light. The red sap continued to drip from his body, leaving a trail that seemed to sink into the earth. Ryan was the first to falter. He tripped over a root and fell hard, his flashlight clattering to the ground. "Wait!" he cried, scrambling to his feet. We stopped just long enough to pull him up, but the delay cost us. The trees around us began to shift, their trunks groaning as they twisted into new positions. The path we'd been following was gone, replaced by an unbroken wall of bark and branches. Dana's breathing quickened. "It's like the forest is alive, it's moving. It is alive," Evelyn said through gritted teeth. "We've seen enough to know that." The ground beneath us vibrated faintly, a rhythmic pulse that matched the red sap oozing from the trees. It wasn't just the forest that was alive, it was aware. As we pressed on, the faces in the trees grew more vivid, their expressions shifting between anguish and rage. Some of the faces seemed familiar, too familiar. I stopped in my tracks when I recognized one. It was Luis, or at least a version of him. His face was etched into the bark of a tree, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. "Evelyn," I said, my voice shaking. "Look." She turned, her flashlight beam landing on the tree. Her face hardened, but she said nothing. "It's not just Luis," Dana whispered, pointing to another tree. "Look at that one." The bark held a new face, one I didn't recognize, a woman with hollow eyes and a look of despair. Nearby, another tree bore the image of a man, his features twisted in agony. "They're people," Ryan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The trees are people." "No," Evelyn snapped, though her voice wavered. "They're not people. They're something else. Keep moving." But the forest wasn't going to let us go so easily. The ground beneath us shifted again, and a low, guttural sound rumbled through the air. It wasn't a scream or a groan. It was a voice. "Stay." The word was barely audible, but it stopped us cold. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating through the trees and into our bones. "Did you hear that?" Ryan asked, his eyes wide with terror. Evelyn nodded, gripping her knife tighter. "Keep moving," she said again, but her voice was barely a whisper. We didn't know where we were going anymore. The forest had swallowed us whole. The forest tightened around us, branches interlocking like the bars of a cage. The air felt heavier with every step, thick with the coppery scent of the red sap. My legs ached, my lungs burned, and yet the ground seemed to pull me forward, like the earth itself wanted to drag us deeper. Luis wasn't following anymore, not directly. Instead, his face appeared in more trees, twisted and contorted in ways that no longer resembled the man he had been. It was as if the forest had claimed him, piece by piece, spreading his image like a grotesque mural. "We're going in circles," Dana said, her voice trembling. "This is the third time we've passed that tree." She pointed to a gnarled trunk, its bark carved with strange, jagged symbols that hadn't been there before. Evelyn glanced at the tree, her jaw tightening. "It's not the same tree," she said, though her tone was unconvincing. "Yes, it is," Dana snapped. "We're trapped. We can't get out." Evelyn rounded on her. "Panicking isn't going to help. We keep moving. That's the only way." Ryan crouched near the base of the tree, running his fingers over the strange carvings. "These weren't here earlier," he murmured. "It's like someone or something marked it after we passed." Let's not stick around to figure out why, Evelyn said, pulling him to his feet. We trudged on, but the forest's influence was growing stronger. The ground seemed to ripple beneath us like the surface of a living organism. I couldn't shake the sensation that we were walking on something that could feel us, something that wanted us to sink into its depths. Dana stopped abruptly, clutching her head. "I can hear it," she whispered. "Hear what?" Evelyn asked, though the tension in her voice betrayed her own fear. "The trees," Dana said. Her eyes were wide, unfocused. "They're talking, whispering." "Stop it," Evelyn barked. "That's just exhaustion. Don't let your mind play tricks on you." But Dana didn't look convinced. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against her temples. Ryan wasn't faring much better. He stumbled along behind us, muttering under his breath. "They're inside," he kept saying. "They're in the air, the ground, they're in me." When he finally collapsed, Evelyn rushed to him, shaking him by the shoulders. "Ryan, snap out of it. We're going to get through this." But Ryan didn't respond. His eyes were glassy, fixed on something we couldn't see. His lips moved, whispering words I couldn't hear. Then, slowly, he raised his hand to his chest where red veins had begun to form beneath his skin. "No," Evelyn said, her voice breaking. "No, not you too." Ryan looked up at her, his mouth curving into a faint, eerie smile. "It's already too late," he said. "We belong to it now." And with that, he crumpled to the ground, his body convulsing as the forest began to claim him. Ryan's body writhed on the ground, his skin darkening as the red veins spread like wildfire. Dana screamed, backing away as if she could distance herself from the horror unfolding before us. Evelyn stood frozen, her eyes wide as Ryan let out a choked gasp, his mouth twisting into an unnatural grin before going still. Then he opened his eyes. They were no longer human, just deep, empty voids, reflecting nothing but darkness. His limbs twitched, and his body moved with a jerky, puppet-like motion as he slowly got to his feet. "Run!" Evelyn shouted, snapping us out of our paralysis. We bolted through the trees, the air thick with the sound of creaking branches and groaning wood. The forest seemed alive, twisting and shifting around us as if mocking our desperation. Paths that had been clear moments ago vanished, replaced by walls of bark and gnarled roots. Dana tripped, falling hard onto the ground. I turned back to help her, but she was already scrambling to her feet, her face pale and streaked with tears. "It's not letting us leave," she panted. "It's hurting us." She wasn't wrong. Every direction we turned led us deeper into the maze, the trees closing in tighter and tighter. The faces in the bark became more distinct, more menacing, their mouths forming silent screams as their hollow eyes tracked our movements. "We need to regroup," Evelyn yelled, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Stick together." But the forest had other plans. The ground beneath us began to pulse, rhythmic and steady, like the heartbeat of some ancient, unseen entity. The red sap oozed from more trees now, dripping onto the soil and pooling around our feet. The air grew heavier, suffused with the sickly sweet stench of decay. Suddenly a low guttural sound rumbled through the woods, a deep vibrating growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "What the hell was that?" Dana whispered, her voice trembling. "Keep moving," Evelyn commanded, though her own fear was evident. "Don't stop, don't look back." But it was impossible not to. Behind us Ryan was coming. He moved through the trees with an unsettling speed, his jerky, unnatural gait making him look more like a marionette than a man. His mouth hung open in a twisted grin, and the red sap dripped from his hands, leaving streaks of crimson on every tree he touched. "He's leading it!" Dana cried, pointing at him. "He's leading the forest after us!" Evelyn grabbed Dana's arm and yanked her forward. "It doesn't matter, just run!" We broke into a sprint, our boots pounding against the uneven ground. The forest seemed to pulse in time with our frantic steps, its groans and creaks growing louder. Branches reached out like skeletal fingers, snagging on our clothes and packs. I could feel the forest pressing in on me, the weight of it suffocating. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't dare stop. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a single chilling thought took root. The forest wasn't letting us leave because we weren't intruders anymore. We were part of it now. The forest's grip on us tightened, its pulsating presence all-encompassing. Every step we took seemed heavier, as if the ground itself wanted to swallow us whole. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were moving in circles, no matter how far we ran. The same trees loomed around us, bleeding red and groaning like they were alive. Evelyn slowed, her breath ragged. She stopped abruptly and turned to face us, her expression grim. "We're not going to find a way out," she said. "Not like this." "What are you saying?" Dana demanded, her voice shaking. "We need to figure out what this forest wants," Evelyn said, gripping her knife tightly. "It's not random. It's keeping us here for a reason." Ryan's voice, if it could still be called his voice, echoed through the woods, distorted and hollow. "You don't belong out there," he said, his tone mocking and strangely melodic. "You belong here. You always have." We turned to see him standing just beyond the tree line, his body half hidden in shadow. The red sap dripped steadily from his fingers, pooling at his feet like blood. Evelyn stepped forward, her knife gleaming in the faint light. "What do you want from us?" she demanded. Ryan tilted his head, his grin widening unnaturally. "It's not about what I want," he said. "It's what the forest wants. It's hungry, and you've fed it well." Dana let out a strangled sob, clutching at her temples. "This isn't happening. This isn't real." "It's real," I muttered, my throat dry. "It's all real." The ground beneath us trembled, and the trees groaned louder, their branches twisting toward us like reaching arms. The faces in the bark grew more distinct, their features contorting in expressions of rage and anguish. Evelyn kept her focus on Ryan. "If the forest is alive, then it can be reasoned with," she said, though her voice wavered. "We didn't come here to harm it. We just need to leave." Ryan's hollow eyes glittered with amusement. "You don't understand," he said. "The forest doesn't let go of what belongs to it, and now you do." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The sap on Luis, on Ryan, on the trees, it wasn't just some natural anomaly. It was alive. It was the forest itself, claiming them, assimilating them into its vast ancient network. And now it wanted us. Evelyn's face hardened. "Not without a fight," she muttered, raising her knife. But the forest was faster. The ground split open beneath us, roots surging upward like massive, coiled snakes. Dana screamed as one of them wrapped around her ankle, yanking her to the ground. Evelyn slashed at the roots with her knife, but they just kept coming, relentless and unyielding. "Run!" Evelyn shouted at me. "Go!" But I couldn't leave, not when the forest had made it clear. There was nowhere to go. Evelyn's command to run echoed in my mind, but my legs wouldn't move. I stood frozen, watching as the forest unleashed its wrath. The roots coiled tighter around Dana, dragging her toward the gnarled base of a massive tree. She screamed, clawing at the ground, but it was no use. The red sap bubbled up from the earth, swallowing her hands as if the forest itself was devouring her. "Help me!" she cried, her voice raw with terror. Evelyn slashed wildly at the roots, her blade glinting in the flickering light. For a moment it seemed like she might free Dana, but then the tree shifted. Its bark split open, revealing a hollow cavity filled with writhing, crimson-coated tendrils. They lashed out, pulling Dana inside. Her scream cut off abruptly as the tree sealed itself shut, leaving nothing behind but a faint smear of red. "Dana!" Evelyn shouted, pounding her fists against the tree's bark. But the forest didn't care. The ground shuddered violently, and I stumbled, falling to my knees. The red sap began to seep from the earth around me, spreading like veins through the soil. I tried to scramble away, but the sap clung to my hands, sticky and warm. Evelyn grabbed my arm, yanking me to my feet. "We're not giving up," she said, though her voice was strained with panic. Behind us, Ryan's hollow laughter echoed through the trees. "There's no fighting it," he said, his voice a mix of mockery and pity. "You're already part of it. Just let it happen." Evelyn turned to face him, her knife raised. "Come and get me, you bastard," she shouted. Ryan stepped forward, his movements fluid and unnatural. "You don't need to fight," he said softly. "The forest gives, the forest takes. It's all the same in the end." Before Evelyn could respond, the ground beneath her erupted. A massive root shot up, wrapping around her waist and lifting her into the air. She screamed, slashing at it with her knife, but the blade only glanced off its thick, bark-like surface. I watched in horror as the root tightened, forcing the knife from her hand. Evelyn's cries turned to gasps as the red sap seeped into her skin, spreading like veins of fire. Her body convulsed, and for a moment I thought I saw her face flicker, her features melting into something unrecognizable. "Run," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. But I didn't run. There was nowhere to go. The forest pulsed around me, its groans and creaks growing louder. The faces in the trees stared, their hollow eyes filled with malice and hunger. The red sap climbed higher on my skin, its warmth seeping into my veins. I collapsed to the ground, my vision blurring as the forest closed in. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was Evelyn's face, now part of the nearest tree, her hollow eyes watching me with a look of resigned sorrow. The forest had claimed us all. Hey guys, if you like my videos, please like and subscribe to my channel. I would really appreciate it. Thanks.